Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are joining us from. Welcome to the NePAAA webinar series number 5 under the ATMI ASEAN project. This webinar series is an initial activities of the network, which will be the way forward of the ATMI ASEAN project beyond its life cycle. There will be more coming up. Therefore, if you are new to our project or this webinar series, and be interested in receiving updates on the webinar series, please type your email on the chat box. We will collect your email address and share the invitation for the next webinar series in your mailbox. My name is Anik Fadila, Policy Facilitator of IFPRI. I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm thrilled to welcome today Dr. David Laborde. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. He is a senior research fellow in Markets, Trade and Institutions Division and the theme leader on macroeconomics and trade for IFPRI. His research interests include globalization, international trade, measurement and modeling of protectionism, multilateral and regional trade liberalization, as well as environmental issues such as climate change and biofuels. Recently, he has been focusing on costing the roadmap to achieving SDG 2 in a globalized context while considering the role of goods, capital, and migration flows. Today, he will be talking on impacts of the Ukraine conflict on global food prices, food security, and the specific implication for ASEAN countries. Dr. Laborde is joining us, I think, from Washington, D.C. So good evening, Dr. Laborde.
Good evening and good morning for you.
Oh yeah, good morning. And a very good morning from our team in New Delhi. So would you like to start your presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Please.
And let me share my screen. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. And I'm going to discuss today the impact of the Ukraine conflict, but also beyond it, the current situation on world markets in terms of food security, looking at it through different angles. And of course, I will emphasize the situation and the policy option for ASEAN countries, in particular in the last part of my presentation. So just a couple of words of introduction. This is a work we have started at IFPRI in February this year. The first blog we released on the situation is dated from February the 24th, so the day of the invasion. And it is based on the work we have done in particular with my colleague Joe Glober. But I really invite you to go on the IFPRI website to see a number of blog resource papers done by various researchers at IFPRI from the country level to the global scale. So why we are dealing with this situation right now, and why the food security, or more exactly the food insecurity, has become a key issue and a key topic at the highest level of policy dialogue, both in the G7 in Germany or G20 in Indonesia in the last couple of weeks. Globally, food insecurity has been rising since 2015 with the combination of what we call the 3 Cs. So the conflict, and the conflicts above have both a local dimension. So the war in Yemen, the civil war in northern part of Ethiopia has created very hotspot of food insecurity. But of course, the conflict in Ukraine has brought a global dimension to this type of issue. And as I've said, we track the situation at IFPRI. But obviously, also we are dealing with a climate situation that has deteriorated and has actually contributed to reducing food supply last year, leading to lower level of inventories, and actually making the situation much more tense. And it is partly due to that a shock like the Ukraine invasion is leading to important move on prices. And just to say that the last global food policy report of IFPRI is really focusing on this climate change aspect. And last but not least, we have the COVID-19 situation that in some part of the world is phasing out. In Africa, we have surge of cases. And even earlier this year, China has to implement lockdown. And this COVID-19 crisis that now is going for more than 2 years has put stress on global value chain and also on local value chain by disrupting transportation, creating bottlenecks, but also reducing income of many households, in particular poor households, and also reducing the fiscal capacity of countries to address this new crisis, especially by providing more income through safety net to their own population. So that's really this combination of elements that lead to the major food insecurity concern today. Now, this in this situation, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has impacted the food system through 3 channels: directly the food markets, and I will of course go back on these topics and detail it a bit more, but also on fertilizer. And that's why there is a concern not only for this year, but for next year, and on fuel, because still our food system and our economy as a whole are highly dependent on the price of energy. And the UN are looking at this, but they also clearly identified the 4th F, that is finance. I will not talk too much about it, but just obviously keep it in mind that the lack or the possibility to access finance, if you are a small farmer, if you are a medium-sized enterprise, or if you are a government, is going really to dictate how you can respond to this crisis. And just on this slide, I also show you that my first 3 F, meaning fuel, fertilizer, and food, are interlinked. Here you see for the last 16 years how these prices have moved together, and in particular how they have spiked together during the last large food price crisis in 2008 and the most recent one, and where we really have this type of always, I will say, ranking where food prices increase, but they are more stable than oil prices. And fertilizer prices actually tend to respond in a much more extreme way than energy or food. And this hierarchy largely represent how the different supplies are elastic and can respond to a crisis. Actually, even if farmers have a cycle of production, more or less every 6 months we have harvest, especially at the global level. So adjusting production can take place relatively easily. For energy and fossil fuel product, here we have first a lower number that can actually increase their production, because if you don't have fossil fuel, you cannot start to produce more when more or less every country in the world have farmers. But the fertilizer is even more a narrow market, with less countries producing fertilizer than producing fossil fuel. And of course, that's going to lead to that. And why we care so much about this also is that the price of fertilizer compared to the price of food product tell you a story about farmer margins. And that's what we face today is, especially, and I mean for ASEAN countries, that will be a key issue. The price of a commodity like rice today have not increased, when the price of maize, the price of wheat have increased a lot. But the price of fertilizer has increased for everyone. So if you are rice farmers today, you are facing a significant challenge, much more than if you are, let's say, a maize farmer, because once again, the price of maize have increased. So even if you have to pay more for your fertilizer, even if your margin are going to start to deteriorate, you can still recover a bit. So that's the overall story we are going to look at, and why we want to look at these three aspects together. Food. Just to say that, once again, before this invasion, we already had rising prices, basically since the beginning of 2021. And now, if you look at the FAO Food Price Index, especially in real terms, it's going to decrease a bit this month, as it had decreased last week, but we are still at very high level historically. We have to go back to the 70s to see the type of prices that we are looking at today. And to many aspects, I will say the 70s, with drought, with export restriction, with conflict, equal to the current situation that we are facing today. And associated with this rise of food price index, we also have a rising acute food insecurity numbers, 200 million by the end of 2020. This year, we may go up to about 300 million. If you look at the number of undernourished people on a chronic basis in the last SOFI report released last week, you will see that the upper bound for 2021 is 826 millions. So he also rising hunger before this invasion, coming from the different driver I have discussed. And really, that's where this invasion of Ukraine is a kind of a last drop, but on a bucket that was already full and was actually already overflowing. So why people now talk so much about Ukraine and Russia is that these two countries, if you look at their export and you convert their different food product, they represent 12% of the global market of calories. We've put together the two countries 1/3 of the wheat that is traded internationally, so not produced, but traded internationally. And when you are actually a wheat importer, you don't really care that China produce a lot of wheat, because you are never going to buy wheat from China. So that's why we really focus on the contribution on the different markets, especially for the food importing countries. And but for wheat, Russia is at least twice and a bit more the size of Ukraine. But for other commodity like sunflower oil, it's about 75% of the world market that is supplied by these two countries. And for maize, Ukraine is now representing about 15% of the maize market, and also the two countries represent a significant share in terms of barley. And from this simple slide, you see that yes, they are important suppliers, but of course they are not the only one. But you see that even if the media, there was a lot of discussion on wheat, it's not only the wheat market that is going to be impacted by that. There is a wheat market, so for people eating bread or pasta, that can be important. But there's also the vegetable oil market with sunflower oil. And here we will have, I will discuss a bit more what this vegetable oil market mean for ASEAN countries that do not produce sunflower oil, but of course produce palm oil and import. At least some ASEAN countries are clearly net importer of vegetable oils and are going to be also impacted by that. But with what you see on barley and maize, that's the feed market that is impacted, and in particular for the poultry industry, they are going to feel the pain, and that will lead to some policy response we have already seen in the region. Now, if you see which country is importing and import some calories from Russia or the Russian Federation or Ukraine, obviously the countries that are the most exposed are the countries in the eastern part of Mediterranean, North Africa, the Levant, so countries like Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, Turkey, countries in the Caucasus like Georgia, and in Central Asia that directly trade with these countries. But I will say, if you take countries in South Asia, both India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh are exposed to that, depending on which product we are talking about. But even Indonesia is used to bring a significant amount of wheat from Ukraine. At least quarter or more of the wheat imported normally by Indonesia come from Ukraine. And this year it will basically not happen. And I will come back to this. The rest of the region is not so dependent overall of the Black Sea. Obviously, it's very far. And what we are going to see in East Asia is mainly some maize coming from Ukraine, also contributing to the feed sectors. But beyond that, most of ASEAN countries are basically either exporting or importing commodity like rice, palm oil, and so they are relatively disconnected from the direct impact of what's happened on the Black Sea. Now, as I've said, prices have been rising for some time. Here you start to see how the price of the maize, soybean, and wheat were increasing at the beginning of the year. And on the right-hand side, the very recent evolution. Price of wheat is already back to what they were before the invasion. The markets have started to adjust it. But on this slide, you will see that the price of maize and soybean are still very high. They are as high in 2007 and 8 and are not declining because obviously there are other factors in particular coming from Latin America that are impacting these markets. And that's why I will say if the situation on the wheat market has started to stabilize, still wheat is more expensive than 1 year ago, but it's not as high than, for example, 15 years ago. The situation on corn and soybean is important. Now, this is on world markets. On this slide, I am showing the food price inflation around the world on domestic markets. And of course, there is actually a lot of things that disconnect or at least introduce a gap between how domestic price responds for food, and particular food that people see in shops, because there is a lot of labor costs, services, distribution costs, and what you see on commodity on world market. But you also notice that ASEAN countries today are, even if there is tension and of course people in the street can complain about rising prices, it's not the worst part in the world. And something that here also is linked to the fact that price of rice have still not risen for various reasons we can revisit, but actually, production was good, inventory is very high for rice. The rice market today is very stable. And since it's the main cereal consumed in Southeast Asia, that brings some stability when it's very different in other parts of the world. So clearly concern for the population, but Southeast Asia is not the most exposed right now on this type of impact on consumer. Other parts of the world are suffering much more. Just to say that beyond the crisis in Ukraine, what really matters is how much food is produced and how and what are the growing conditions. Here it's a slide from Geoclam that is based also that contributes to the AMIS group that monitor markets. And as you can see, if you are green, that means that the condition of growing crops is good. So right now also we have a number of rice producing countries that are dealing with good condition. So the rice supply is not really threatened. There is a bit of drought or at least dry condition in some ASEAN countries. But if you compare to the situation in Northern Africa or in South America, you see how you have a lot of orange. For example, in Argentina right now there is drought, or in some parts of the US. You will see why also here ASEAN countries are not exposed to weather shock as other parts of the world, but still that's very important to monitor, to understand how the future harvest will look like, because that can change pretty fast. Now, in this context, what also has made things worse is what we call export restriction, meaning that in order to try to insulate domestic market from rising prices on world markets, a number of countries have implemented export restriction. The most famous one in Southeast Asia is the policy implemented in April by Indonesia in banning palm oil. Since then, it has been softened, and more or less, I would say, fully removed. Today in Indonesia, we have the same type of tax and restriction that we had last year. So we are kind of back to normal. But this has clearly created shortage and uncertainty on world markets. And on the screen right now, you can see the red line that shows the share of calories that were restricted during this crisis. We went up to 17% of the world trade in calories impacted by restriction. And now we are declining, mainly thanks to, of course, the softening of the Indonesia policies, but also from other countries. Now, in Southeast Asia, we also had some policy that doesn't really matters globally or will not even appear on this graph when you think about the global share of calories, but that can be pretty important. That's the type of export restriction that Malaysia has put in place for their chicken and poultry sector that has impacted Singapore very significantly, because Singapore at that time mainly sourced poultry from Malaysia. And I will say, similarly to Indonesia, these type of policies are not very efficient, because the main problem that Malaysia is facing is very high price of feed. So you have a problem to produce chicken because feed is expensive. And the response of basically blocking your farmers to sell, including to Singapore, and basically to get a good price for their chicken, is not really going to solve this. So you see, and same thing for Indonesia, a big, even if the pain of the policy was felt, for example, in India, it's also the smallholders of the palm fruit in Indonesia that has suffered from these policies. So really, even if we can understand why policymakers want to go in this direction, having a serious discussion about, is it the best policy to achieve your goal and actually to strengthen your food system, has to be reviewed. Yes, here it's to show an illustration about which countries are the most impacted in the world by the export restriction we have seen. Country in South Asia, and so you will see a lot of low and middle income countries that finally pay the price of these policies. And we are shifting the burden, unfortunately, to some of the most vulnerable people and countries when we use this policy. So let me move now to the fertilizer markets. That, as I have said initially, it's a pretty highly concentrated market. And in particular, when we are going to look at phosphate and potash. Nitrogenous is more diverse, mainly because you can produce nitrogenous everywhere if you have access to natural gas or coal, because we process products like urea from ammonia, and we produce ammonia coming from fossil fuel. And I will revisit this, but it's basically the link between nitrogenous market and fossil fuel that matter. For phosphate and for potash, here you see the picture is different. First, because between 70 and 80% of phosphate and potash that are used by farmers in the world has been traded internationally. So these markets matters. And when you look at them, you will see that the four main producers represent between 2/3 and 3/4 of the markets. So every time you have a shock on these suppliers, there is problems. So for phosphate, Russia is a supplier, but also China. And what China has done last year is to put export restriction on their phosphate. So that was a direct impact for a number of farmers in Southeast Asia. Similarly, for potash, you have three countries in the world that represent 3/4 of the production. It's Canada, Russia, and Belarus. And nowadays, Russia and Belarus are involved in this war, involved in international sanctions, and their capacity to export this product to the rest of the world has been reduced. And that's a concern. And that's a concern for a number of Southeast Asian countries, because there is not so many alternatives in terms of finding potash. And some also of the crops that they are producing, maybe not so much rice, but actually palm fruit, banana, and similar things, are potash intensive crops. So really finding the supply and finding where this potash can come from is an important concern for the countries. And here on this map, I just show the dependency of imports divided by agricultural use by countries for N, P, and K. And you will see that in Southeast Asia, mainly because a number of Southeast Asian countries have natural gas, it means also that they produce some nitrogenous fertilizer, urea, and things. So they are less dependent on world markets, while for potash and phosphate, they have to import. Most of them doesn't have access to it. So that's why they have concern about both the war, the sanctions, and also the export restriction that a country like China has put in place. And so, yeah, just to say that here it's something on export restriction for fertilizer. There is a number of countries that have put such restriction, in particular Russia and China. And here also we have about 20% of the world trade of fertilizer that is currently restricted by policy measures. So energy markets, here, of course, you may have heard that the price of oil has increased. That's obviously linked to the fact that Russia is a key producer. But what I really want to emphasize is what's happened on the natural gas market, because here also it's where the link between natural gas and fertilizer prices, and so nitrogen fertilizer, urea, and ammonia are so important. So you need this to produce your fertilizer. And starting last year, so once again, at the beginning, second quarter of 2021, the price in Europe, that is the blue line here, has started to increase drastically, especially compared to the price of the US, that is the purple. Because the price of Europe has increased, it also means that a lot of the liquefied natural gas that both the Gulf countries, but also Australia, a number of ASEAN countries are producing, I've seen the price rising. And some actually of the supply from this eastern part of the world has been moved to Europe. And the more we have the tension between, and today we already have Russia that have stopped to deliver some natural gas to Europe, the more Europe try to find alternative source of natural gas, that puts price up, that puts price of fertilizer up everywhere in the world, knowing also that Europe tried to buy more fertilizer on world markets because at home it's not profitable to make them. Put it differently, the price of fertilizer have been multiplied by 3, but the price of natural gas in Europe have been multiplied by 7. So fertilizer company in Europe cannot be really produce too much. And actually we haven't seen this year, when we have a shortage of fertilizer, we have seen European plants closing because it's not making sense. So really, that's one of the key channels to keep in mind. And as I've said, if we look at the price of liquefied natural gas in Asia, it's follow the dynamic in Europe. And so that's something to take into account. So it also means that for countries that export oil or natural gas in Southeast Asia, that's a good news. You know, some countries make more money this year. So one of the big questions is what the government is going to do with this money. But you have also countries in Southeast Asia that are net energy importer, and for them that means that they have to pay more for their energy, and that's a concern. The price of oil also is going to be to have consequences on the cost of international transportation. Here is the price index of maritime transportation. As you see today, is not as high as it was in 2007, because the price of oil is just one element about what drives the cost of international transportation. Similarly, at some point during the COVID crisis, in particular last year, we had rising prices because there was a shortage of ships. But today, we are in rising period again, and it means that the cost of moving everything, but also food internationally, is going to be more expensive. So that's where, you know, if you, in some case, I mean, global markets are very important, but also regional markets. And of course, delivering to your neighbor will always cost you less money and energy than trying to cross half of the world. So thinking, about how, how about we deal with trade cost is important. Now on this slide, I just show and combine what it means in terms of your net import cost on your GDP when you combine all of this, meaning the price of food, the price of energy, and things like this. And still, as of today, most of the ASEAN countries are going to have an import bill that will increase coming from this crisis. Because some import, as I've said, food, some import fuel, some import fertilizer. And when you combine all of that, even if some can more or less balance the situation, like Malaysia, most of them are going to have a negative impact on their current account. When obviously for Australia or for Saudi Arabia, that's very different because the price of primary product and how big it is in their overall current account will dominate. So let me conclude now by some policy response aspect. And that's something we did at the beginning of the crisis. Obviously some countries have listened and other countries have not listened to. But first, there is something problematic with biofuel subsidies and mandate. That's true for the US, that's true for Indonesia. For Indonesia, the desire to maintain their strong biofuel policy is one of the reasons why they had to put some export ban to keep basically palm oil both for their food consumer but also for their biofuel sectors. When at one point there is a problem here, I mean that let the market decide if people or cars should consume crops. If it is policy mandate, then policymakers have a responsibility about what is going on. And in some cases, we may want to have some incentive to deal with the decarbonization of the transport sectors. But let's be clear that biofuel is really a suboptimal policy, compared to car electrification and things like this. That is, producing electricity based on renewable will always have a much better carbon footprint than any biofuel process car. Do target social safety net, because yes, in your country, the most vulnerable people are going to suffer from this, both from the fuel and the food inflation. Some countries still need to rely to humanitarian programs. That's obviously true for a country like Yemen, but there is also a number of refugees around the world that have to get access to food. This is done through WFP, and with increasing food prices, there is a need for more resources. There is also a need to make sure that producer and consumer can be flexible and adjust their decision. You don't want to protect everyone from the price increase, meaning that some industry will have to consume less, some consumer will have to consume less. The question is, we want that this adjustment is not done by the most vulnerable people. And in the don'ts, what we say is, let trade help rebalancing the system, and it has already worked not too bad, especially if you see how the wheat market is reacting today. Don't start to hoard and to do panic buying, because you make the situation worse. Similarly, if you want to support your farmers, I will say it's important to avoid to target specific crops. So what we see today is a lot of government have decided to subsidize wheat production. Not so much in ASEAN countries, but around the world, when actually farmers already were adjusting to that the wheat price today is back to what it was 5 months ago. And we are going to potentially have an oversupply of wheat, when if we had let the farmers decide based on market signal, they will have a more balanced approach, and they will think exactly about which crop they want. Last but not least, I will say, let's make sure that we don't sacrifice medium and long-term sustainable goal and environmental initiative just to deal with a 3 or 6 month panic. If you start to increase deforestation just to produce more this year, the stock of carbon you will lose or the biodiversity you will lose, you will not recover it next year. So really there is a need to really balance short-term goals and long-term objectives. And I think I will stop here. I have a few more elements to raise, but I will just, to conclude, I will just say this crisis has shown that, that all food systems, when they are weakened by different shocks, COVID, climate, and perturbation due to conflict, are at risk. But they also show how incredible resilient they are up to now. Imagine the amount of stress we are putting on them. We are dealing with a conflict that at a global scale is at least as important as what we have seen in the 70s, maybe, World War II, because we have one nuclear power that is involved in a direct confrontation with one country and in indirect confrontation with other nuclear power. We also had very severe drought in the world as we have not seen for more than 40 years. And we had the COVID-19, that is a type of pandemic we have not seen. But I would say thanks to years of investment in developing food system, in many places, investing in agriculture, in building safety nets, we are not dealing with 1 billion of people dying of famine, When I don't want to extrapolate, but if we had similar shock 50 years ago, that's what we will be ending with. Because in the 70s, we have very terrible famine in India and things like this, when we were not dealing with even half of this type of problem. So yes, past investment matters, building resilience matters, but just we don't want to continue to put additional stress, because at one point, yes, food system cannot cope with it anymore. And last but not least, we have clearly this discussion that we need to have about fertilizer. In a number of countries, in particular in Asia, there is overuse of fertilizer. So increasing fertilizer efficiency is very important, both, as you see in this crisis, for good economic management, because it's costly to waste fertilizer, but also there is an environmental outcome of it. And thinking about new way to produce ammonia, like green ammonia, or really making sure that we optimize crops, soil, and fertilizer use are key things for tomorrow. And once again, showing that you can make choices that are good for the environment and good for the pocket of the farmers and for the pocket of the government, if today is subsidizing use of fertilizer that are not optimal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. David. We have one question, and for other participants, we invite you to also type your question on the Q&A box on the bottom of your Zoom monitor, and then we will read your question. We have question from Rahmawati Zulfiningrum. My apologies, sorry. May I request the PPT of Dr. David? I think she sent you the request by email, and then her team will conduct research in the food sector, and they would like to cite the information from the webinar today. So.
Yes, I will send it, and I think also you can send it to every participant and,
yes,
and people that want it. No problem on that.
Okay, thank you so much. So is there any question from other participants? So while waiting for other, okay, we have one question from, sorry, cannot see it. Okay, I think I will allow you to talk directly. You can unmute yourself, yes.
So, Anik, you giving me the permission?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thanks. So thanks, David. This is, as always, very informative. And so one of the issues, which you probably spoke, but somehow it got lost in the wind. Like that's a phenomenal change when it comes to wheat. And if I'm not mistaken, wheat is probably very heavily concentrated when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, right? So what is it that, we had this turnaround in wheat because, just going parallel to what is giving fertilizer, that if you have potash and phosphate and there is kind of real market concentration. If you come from the food side and you look at the global food exports, I mean, we have something very similar concentration in wheat exports with Russia and Ukraine, because India is, for all the noise that is there, and they also put an export ban, it's not going to have any capacity to come anywhere near to filling in where Russia and Ukraine drop out. So I'm just thinking about what is in there, just to get the real driver of this thing in wheat. But if you look at the whole story, the narrative on wheat, and there are a lot of stories you'll see in BBC or everywhere that there are these countries in basically in Middle East, North Africa, they have been very heavily affected, and maybe this narrative has not been updated in that sense, that about high wheat prices. And so has it been like that, there has been a demand side adjustment also in wheat that has kind of really reflected in the prices plateauing out? So yeah, just wanted your views on that.
So excellent point. And yes, I mean, wheat has been the kind of emblematic crops exported by Russia and Ukraine, and with a direct impact on food security for North Africa and the Middle East, that are basically bread-based diet and heavily wheat consumption. Now, the fact is, on one hand, it's relatively much more easy to diversify globally the wheat supply than it is for fertilizer. Even if the global market is concentrated, today it's less concentrated than 40 years ago, for instance. 40 years ago, the US was representing 50% of the global market of wheat. Today, we are saying Russia is 20%, Ukraine 10%, Argentina between 10 and 15, and so on. And today, we have already seen Brazil, since the beginning of the year, planting more wheat, even exporting more of the wheat that they have. Brazil now is exporting to Sudan, is exporting to Saudi Arabia, something they have not done for more than 15 years. So the Southern Hemisphere is already starting to adjust. At the same time, a lot of the wheat importing countries are also wheat producers. So what they have done this year is they have increased also their own production. So their net, if you want, import demand can be adjusted. When for fertilizer, you don't have phosphate, you cannot even mitigate your by domestic production. So that's why, even if sometimes looking at the concentration on the world markets, you can see some similarities. Actually, supply response and demand response are not the same. But the point I want also to raise that sometimes is not fully clear for most people, and to be honest, was not clear for me before I work on this year, is time matters. And Russia and Ukraine are not big wheat exporters, basically in February, March, April, and May, June. Normally, they are not on world markets. Why? Because they harvest most of their wheat in July and August, that are winter wheat in the Northern Hemisphere, and they mainly export it during the second semester of the year. So the fact that during the first semester of the year, we had some disruption linked to Ukraine, Russia, was not as dramatic as it has been. And now for the second semester, we have question mark. But we already have a number of farmers, both in Canada, that have increased their spring wheat plantation. Same thing in Kazakhstan. That means that we will have some extra supply that can help to compensate the situation. But if you just take Indonesia, for example, as ASEAN countries, yes, I was saying 25% of their wheat import come from Ukraine, but all of this wheat is normally imported between August and December. So for a country like Indonesia, the question is really where the wheat will come from during the second half of the year. And it was not if the situation was really dramatic. When, you know, in Lebanon, they bring their wheat from Ukraine all year long. So you see that really create this type of asymmetry. And I mean, in terms of research, you know, how we look at trade and thinking more about the seasonality of trade, in particular for agricultural product, is something I think that we have to do more on that. And now we have more data. But I will say, yes, even, you know, a couple of years ago, and monthly trade data was not really easy. So we were operating a bit in the darkness. Now we can really have a more detailed analysis and really thinking that the timing of the crisis matters about how we want to respond to it. And different countries are going to respond differently based on where are the needs on this issue.
Thank you.
I have additional question related to the just now discussion. You said that Brazil is planting wheat now. Is it a new plantation, or it's old but they try to increase more? Because I hope they are not sacrificing the existing important commodities planting like soybean, because we in Indonesia have a problem with soybean. We always have lately we have a high price of soybean, and it's coming mostly from Brazil also. So do you have any information about this?
So no, I'm pretty sure they are going to produce a lot of soybean this year. So Latin America had to deal with what we call La Nina, that is the symmetric of El Nino. That has been very hard last year, and Latin America has lost basically 31 million tons of soybean due to this climatic shock. So, you know, the climate shock in Latin America is more than what Ukraine is going to put on world market in normal condition. So, you know, sometimes we have to scale things. And that really has created this huge tension on the soybean market and why soybean prices are so high. Now, Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay are hoping to, this year we still have La Nina, so we have 2 La Nina on the row, so we have some question marks, but globally we think that the supply of soybean will increase this year, and that will start to do this. So now, as you said, okay, but if they increase soybean or if they don't want to decrease soybean and they increase wheat, how we do it? They cut more trees. I mean that you are going to see, I'm pretty sure, a record years in terms of deforestation in Brazil this year. Because also on the short run, if you want to produce more, you cannot really increase yield so much. You are going to put more land in production. And that's how Brazil is going to respond to that. But as I've said, unfortunately, that's how you deal with a short-term shock, but with long-term consequences, because you cannot recover from that next year. The trees are not going to grow again. And so, you know, that's always this tension between short-term and long-term adjustment.
Okay, we have question here. So, Dr. Laborde, countries like Thailand have promoted food sufficiency policies as responses to past global food supply disruptions to cushion the impact of rise in food prices. It looks like this has been successful. Countries like Malaysia, who are net importer of food, with local diet shifting from Eastern diet to more Western diet, those dependent on wheat and maize, etc. Using countries should raise and diversify local food production and influence diets centered on local food source. It might reduce the negative impact. Your opinion and comments, please. Thank you.
So on this, I will have a kind of moderate position in the sense that I very strongly in favor of having good nutrition, discussion, and informed consumers. And, you know, we don't need everyone to eat bread and everyone to eat wheat. Obviously, diversity is important and education is important. Now, should it be local and what we call local? That's where I will be much more careful, because most of the shock we face are still local shock. You know, a country like Morocco this year has a drought. They are losing 40% of their food supply. So whatever they have done to have a local source-based food system, it will be in shambles this year, and they will have to import. So I really think that what we need is to make sure that we have diversity in taste from the consumer side, but also diversity in food supply and trading network that are well alive and infrastructure that well alive. Because if tomorrow, and I hope it will never happen, but if Thailand has a severe disease on their rice plantation, for instance, they will be pretty happy to bring the rice from someone else to deal with the loss of a production a year. So, and you know, all this trade network doesn't appear from thin air. You don't just go to, it's like if you were doing your grocery shopping. In order to be able to shop when you need it, you need to have a marketplace. And this marketplace exists only if you use it on a regular basis. Some years you sell, some years you buy, but thinking that I'm going to be protected in my own border because I just bring my food from my own country, that's not going to be a long-term strategy that will pay off with climate change. And I mean that also farmers in Thailand this year wonder about what's happened on the fertilizer. And many in Thailand still need to bring their fertilizer. So really, I think that we should work on more resilient system with strong, you know, making sure that we have a strong fabrics of link. And the fact that does it cross the border or not should not be the criteria to know if it is good or not, but knowing if it is good for the consumers, good for the environment. And if we make sure that farmers have good sustainable productivity, that should be the goal. Not knowing that if I bought my banana from the farmer next door or from 200 kilometers away on the next side of the border, that should not really be the focus of my policymakers, even if sometimes they like to think like that. But yeah, I mean, diversity and managing risk together is on the long run the only way to get through various crises.
Okay, I have I think final question. If you relate this with the SDGs goal with the new condition, what do you think? How far are we to reach the goals?
Oh, we are very far. I mean, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we were not on track, and that was sad. Now with COVID and this, and just the virus, you know, once again, climate shock, the fact also that in order to get to the SDG, we should have spent a lot of money and investing in health, education, of course, agriculture. And right now, money is scarce. Many governments in the world had to use their money, instead of thinking about the long-term development targets, more to deal with crisis after crisis. And so, unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that SDG 2, so SDG 1, we make some progress, but Africa will still lacking behind in terms of extreme poverty. But I think Asia will be done. But SDG 2 on making sure that we eradicate hunger and we provide good diets for everyone, that's too far. Education, we have made progress, but unfortunately also with COVID, a lot of people were not able to get the education they should have. And that also gender implication, you know. So we can catch up. My main message here, hopefully the world will not end in 2030. So, you know, it's not because if we miss 2030 that we should say, okay, too bad, we stop everything. No. We may be delayed. We had to continue. We have made some progresses. As I've said, I think that past investment have already helped today to deal with this crisis. So it's not like if we have waste money and we should have stopped to do things. No. We just need to do more. We need to prioritize. We need also to use evidence and policy dialogue to make sure that every money we spend to achieve the SDG, we spend it well.
Okay, thank you so much for this discussion. I think this is very interesting. Oh, okay. Dr. Defish, would you like to say
Now,
something?
just one last question that
Okay, please.
so
I'll have time. Yeah.
David, just my small question is that, it's a bit of a question of a skeptic. So where is WTO in all this, right? I mean, is it like really with all this crisis that's going on, it's like a further marginalization of WTO? It's I just, in your whole presentation, which is very, very nice, very informative, there was no WTO, right? That term didn't come up. And so I just want to say that, everything is about regional. I mean, so it's like, are we really going on that route that, regionalism? And so all these ASEAN countries, they would be more focused on what is going to be with RCEP, what is going to be with Quad and so on. But where is WTO in all this, right? And even particularly in relation to the crisis. And so if there is any, and you know it so very well, than better than anyone else on here. I just want to say, what are your take on this? Where does the WTO figure in?
So another great question. I would so WTO has still managed to make sure that more or less our world trading system has operated and through the different crises. And even today, even if some countries want to kick Russia out of the WTO, even if some people within Russia want to leave the WTO, Russia is still part of the WTO, and we still have managed to get some agreements on a number of issues 3 weeks ago during the ministerial in Geneva, knowing that Ukraine and Russia will never sit in the same room, but in particular, the new DG of the WTO has done great things in order to find some agreements on some elements in terms of illegal fishery subsidies, in terms of export restriction for the WFP. It's still kind of minimal services. So I'm not going to say, oh, it's wonderful that the WTO has achieved all of that. I mean, I have been positively surprised that they can achieve anything in the current situation. And they still manage a number of, the SPS agreements, things on services. But are they going to be able to really deliver more? That's where I will still remain skeptical. Right now, they just avoid, and they have a positive role in avoiding the system just to explode. I mean, we should not neglect the amount of pressure we have put on, as I've said, on food system, but also in terms of multilateralism, and we are still there, more or less. Now, WTO can only do what countries want to do with it. I mean that, and typically on this export restriction, it's a pledge that countries are going to decide to do it or not. We will see if they want to believe in it. It took basically 10 years between the G20 declaration, where the same country at the G20 say, we want to exclude WFP from any export restriction. And following that, during 10 years at the WTO, they didn't want to repeat it. Now they have done it, so already good. Is it enough? No. Should they do more? Yes. Can they do more? Let's see. But at the same time, what I see that in other places, regional bodies doesn't perform much more efficiently than the WTO. There's a lot of declaration, but sometimes when you start to have a crisis, it's everyone for himself or herself. I mean, in Southeast Asia, I think things are more advanced. But if you think about the situation in South Asia, there is question mark. If you go to many African regional groups, big problems. Same thing in Latin America. So I still think we will need the WTO. I think that it just also, and I will conclude on that, it's just the WTO is really a multilateral institution that tries to deal with big issues. But the world until now has never really understood what multilateralism means, where it's not just about the EU, Japan, and the US, it's about India, it's about China. And we need also that India and China, step by step, take the amount of responsibilities that come with their size. And right now, they are not ready to do that. I mean, they are still in their growing stage, but obviously a country like in China, second world economy, still want to behave or take responsibility equal to a small developing countries, not the number 2 economy in the world. And until we don't have, this behavioral change, I think WTO will be stuck.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. David Laborde, and also participants for the very good discussion about the impact of the Ukraine conflict to the ASEAN countries. For my apology. Oh my God. Okay. For this webinar is recorded and will be posted on YouTube. We will share the recording on our social media, and the PowerPoint we will be sharing also to all participants. And we will have our next NePAAA event on 11 August, a hybrid event from Cagayan de Oro City, Philippines. So we will be sharing the details as soon as possible. So see you in August. Thank you so much, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.